Okay, cool. All right. So I'm just going to start by reading my little intro here that I wrote, and then we'll, yeah, roll.
Yeah,
Okay. And Natapov is the
correct.
correct
Yep, you
pronunciation.
got it.
Okay. All right. Okay. Here we go. Maria Natapov is the star of the show today. She is a step parenting expert and advisor to parenting coaches. Her own lived experience as an immigrant, a child to divorced parents, a divorcee herself, and also becoming a step parent herself has given her so much insight and knowledge on the topic of emotional health and family relationships. So, today we're going to dive into all sorts of family dynamics and important relationship aspects with a focus on helping our kids understand their own emotions better and how to cultivate healthy connections in blended families. We're also going to touch on kids and technology because it's a huge aspect of parenting today. So, Maria, thank you so much for coming on. It's great to see you again. How
Yeah.
are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much. What a wonderful, like warm intro. Thank you. And yeah, I'm just really excited. Like, thank you for creating this platform for us to delve into all the things.
Well, I know it's going to be of great service and value to the audience. So I'd love to start off by having you share a bit about your journey and how your personal experiences led you to where you are now, which is having so much passion in the work that you do.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So as you kind of briskly mentioned, I am an immigrant. And the culture I immigrated from is like a 180 from American way of life, language, culture, values, like the whole nine, how kids are viewed in my former culture. I'm from Moscow, Russia. So, and I immigrated as a child with my family. We were Jewish refugees. So in my former culture, kids are more of a possession. And it's very much obey, see, be seen and not heard, and put your head down. The elders know best. Like just don't make waves, which I know can be true in some American households as well. But I've got the sense when we moved here that the overwhelming majority, like the overwhelming voice of the culture, was very much like kids are encouraged to be autonomous and to make their own decisions and to be guided and supported through becoming autonomous rather than just having all of the decisions made for them. And I think that gave me a really phenomenal opportunity to recognize where there is choice, right? Like, I think it's a little bit harder if you have parents who grew up in the culture that you're growing up in and they know all the ins and outs. The worlds can meld, right? Like what is culturally acceptable and or appropriate or even possible versus what are our parents' preferences. And it may not be so obvious to identify where you have an opportunity to choose your own way. And so I will say though that these insights came much later in life, only in the last few years as I've been really and the journey itself has taken a good 30 years in the making. But I think where it all started to really come together were the last couple of years because I finally was healed enough through my own trauma and my own things and my own, we all have blind spots, right? So everything is a journey. And some of it has to do with even being willing to see things for what they are and, to a degree, accept responsibility and recognize, right, where like thought patterns may not be serving us anymore, or there are different choices or different skills perhaps we can learn and different dynamics we can create. And it's not, I won't say it's easy. It's simple. It's not easy. And I think everybody has their own journey. And again, mine took a very, very long time. But I'm excited to, I guess, share with folks that there are opportunities to, in spite of maybe challenging circumstances or even challenging dynamics, yes. And also, it can get better. And you can have a different relationship with what is going on, and you can choose to feel differently about it. You can choose to respond differently to it. And all of that creates a really powerful ripple. And it inevitably calls out a different response from all of the folks surrounding you and all of those specific situations. So, Yeah, I'm just excited to share that. Um, for me, again, I mentioned how I was raised, my former culture. It turned into getting into an abusive relationship for my first romantic relationship, which is with my ex-husband. And I stayed for a really long time because I think I had certain needs at that time that he was fulfilling, like a lot of encouragement and a lot of support and a lot of praise. And my culture just wasn't that way. I was
Mhm.
parented in a way where, like criticism leads to your best self, right? Like we're going to inspire you to greatness by tearing you to shreds. And it didn't work. But I didn't know, and I didn't realize or recognize those patterns because it was all I had ever known. So my ex had sort of narcissistic tendencies, and what I have learned that that looks like is um, they can really like pull you in with a lot of like love, like it's called love bombing, and then they kind of rip you apart, or maybe they get super cold and distant from you, and everything is your fault, or um, just a confusing fighting in circles where you're feeling like you're almost crazy or you can't keep up with the conversation because it keeps shifting on you. Like first we're focusing on one theme, and then suddenly as soon as you feel like you're getting caught up and you're joining the conversation, they switch, flip the script on you, and suddenly you're talking about something else and you're like, wait, how did we? And you're just trying to get your
Yeah.
bearings. Um, just those kinds of tactics, some manipulation, isolation, those were all things that I was experiencing. But, when we chatted, I mentioned there's this analogy that somebody pointed out to me as I was making sense of this experience, and it was the frog in the water. So if you take a frog and you put it in boiling water, it's going to scream, it's going to realize it's being boiled. But if you put it in regular room temperature water and you just turn the degree slowly, or turn the temperature up 1 degree at a time, and you do it really slowly so it has an opportunity to adjust, it's not going to realize that eventually it's being boiled, and it's not going to notice basically that its environment is changing. And that's what my experience was like in a nutshell. I one day was like, how did I get here? And I mentioned to people, my ex would watch Jerry Springer, and there were like all these kind of, ridiculous, it seemed like exaggerated scenarios of women like just totally almost being like slaves to men. Like they're like clipping their toenails on their knees in front of them. And I realized at one point, like, wow, that's me. I didn't think that was me. I thought that I
Mm.
was educated and I was informed, and I'd noticed the red flags because I went out of my way. Like those things interested me, and I kept up with relationship dynamics and what is healthy and what's not. But again, we all have our blind spots, and I couldn't recognize that I had become this person. It just looked different, right? Like the players were different. I looked different, and I wasn't, necessarily on my knees, clipping toenails, but essentially I was very subservient and being isolated and becoming somebody I didn't recognize, right? Like normally I was very assertive and very capable, and I felt very incapable and very much just like a klutz and incompetent in this relationship. And I think essentially my best word of advice around how I recognize that or how I got there is just, I think the pain of that experience had to outweigh, right? Like, as I mentioned, what got me there to begin with was the need outweighed the negatives, right? So like
Yep.
that took priority. And so that's what got me there, and that's what kept me there. And then I think at one point, as I healed through, maybe discovered my own power. I mean, I was working and I was the primary breadwinner, which oftentimes, from what I've heard, that's a little bit uncommon. Typically, women who find themselves in these relationships oftentimes are like maybe stay-at-home moms, or their partner is the primary breadwinner, or certainly like is making significantly more money, and they're kind of feeling a little bit shackled to that situation. And it takes a lot more for them to be able to leave. I didn't
Yeah.
have children, and I was the primary breadwinner. So it was a little bit different. And so I was fortunate to have had these other experiences at work where I was very capable and recognized as a very capable person. And I think through that, I had grown. And so maybe I started to wake up subconsciously to this other part of myself and this ability, or this way of seeing myself that I'd never seen myself as before. And so at that point, I think that's when like the pain started to become bigger than any of the positives. And
Mhm.
I truthfully, I think the reason I stayed for so long, because I stayed for 16 years, was because I think that's how long it took for that to grow to the degree to which I couldn't ignore it. And I had to take action because it's what a horrible action to take, right? Like you don't want to have to untangle your life
Mm,
emotionally and physically and financially from another person who you thought you were going to spend the rest of your life with, that you've like built up this whole, future with, and you've already spent and invested so much energy and time into creating this partnership. And so I think that's what it was. The pain had to grow to the level at which it was a level of toxic I just could not ignore. And I was like, regardless of anything else, even if it's a temporary break, I need to get away just to breathe and think and be, and then we can figure it out. Um, yeah. So through all of that, it was, a very messy experience. And then, of course, even once I started to realize that, the journey of fully understanding my role in it and, the degree to which all of these unhealthy thought patterns and behaviors and beliefs and all of it, was playing out. And the work then that I had to do, because I think another component was I already had some trauma, but then being in this relationship sort of exacerbated that.
mm.
And now I had like new trauma, or perhaps compound trauma, if you will. So it wasn't easy to untangle all of those webs of just understanding life, myself, all the roles, the relationships of what went on there, and then having to put all of that in order, so that I could move on and find a healthy situation for myself. Um, and yeah, I found myself, you know, I met my husband who had a daughter. And as what I thought a responsible person at that point in my life with everything that was going on, I was like, I'll be your wing woman. Like, this is absolutely not the situation to bring any child. Like, you need to keep me away from her. No. And his response to me was, because I had had caregivers and I knew what I didn't like about those experiences, I would make a much better caregiver than I was giving myself credit for. And that kind of floored me, and it took a little while for that to wash over me. And then after a few days, I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to give this my absolute all. Like, I'm essentially making a commitment, like no matter what. I hadn't even met her yet, but I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, this has to be serious, because I'm a child of divorce. I am a child of, step parents and step siblings and all of that. And it's not easy. And so I knew, I didn't want to add to this little girl's stressors. Like, it's already stressful. It's already painful and really difficult. So I knew that I did not want to be contributing to her in any sort of negative way. So I had to get clear with my intention. And then I was like, okay, like let's give this a go. And yeah, we hit it off super well. Um, right away, which was amazing. She's just awesome and like impossible not to love. But I can't say it was all peaches and cream, because certainly, just naturally there's tensions in these dynamics. And she also was going through abuse and neglect, which we didn't know about, with her mom and her mom's partner. And it had lasted for years. And again, we would like check in because she was little, and you just never know, right? Like, there's all these new people in her life. Um, but she was being silenced. So she just denied and kind of deflected until one day, 5 years later, she told an anecdote, and I was horrified. And I was like, okay, don't freak out, don't freak out, don't freak out. Let her talk. Don't freak out, because I didn't want her to get scared and kind of like suck it all back in, because that's kids are so perceptive and also are young and don't know what things mean, right? Like they start to blame themselves often. That's often the conclusion that they jump to. So yeah, so it was a scary reality. And yeah, that's how she ended up coming to live with us full time. And that was for about 6 years. And then as of last December in 2023, I officially adopted her. And Yeah, that's when she first came to live with us. It just so happened very commonly. I'm sure you're aware, Olivia, and we can chat a little bit more about this. But so whenever somebody gets out of a very significant abusive situation, emotionally and physically, or physically, it doesn't matter whether it's one type of abuse or multiple types. Commonly, there's like a honeymoon period, right? It feels like a temporary vacation when they first are leaving that situation. And it feels like, any minute now the other shoe is about to drop. And when it starts to finally feel more permanent, which really just depends, it could be a matter of months, sometimes even longer. Um, Basically, that's one kind of, pardon my language, am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, go
Or,
ahead.
okay. But that's basically when shit hits the fan, right? And that's when they start to really process the emotional trauma that they have endured. And so that's very much what happened for her about, I'd say, like 6 to 8 months after the fact of living with us full time. And right then is when my company restructured. I was working in healthcare. And as I was job searching, my heart wasn't in it. I had like a supportive role. I had a role with the C-suite executives and then also those sales and marketing departments. And it just was too far removed for me. I wanted something more hands-on and to be, really working directly with folks to essentially guide them through similar experiences as what I had been through. And I stumbled on a trauma-informed parent coaching program, and I was enrolled within like 48 hours. And and then when I joined blended family support groups around that same time, because I was looking for support, I was like, okay, we're really struggling, but I'm sure all these other blended families have it together. Like I need some advice. And that's when I discovered that like we're all struggling, even if there isn't abuse and neglect happening. It's just difficult. And I think it didn't dawn on me before. And I think I didn't realize that I acquired skills from my previous experience of being an immigrant and kind of going through that journey my whole life, kind of having to, learn how to function in new circles, if you will, build new rapports with people and having to identify like what are their priorities and how do I support them or how do I fit into that. I think I didn't realize that these are skills that others were struggling with specifically as it comes to the blended family dynamic. And that's when I was like, okay, I mean, I could share some of these tools. And so that's when it dawned on me that, I had something valuable to offer others who are in a similar situation. So yeah, so that's basically how I came to do what I do. And yeah, that's the full circle of it.
And it really is a full circle. Like that's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing that.
Of
There's so
course.
many levels to it where you experience something, whether it was like you were directly involved in that situation or you were kind of, just a part of it, kind of on the sidelines, being affected by, what was going on. There's just so many levels there of like understanding and experience that really does, you know, like you say, like bring it full circle. Um, I was curious. So when your stepdaughter, when she moved in with you, how old was she at that time?
She was 12. So I met her originally when she was just turning 7. It was her 7th birthday. And yeah, so 5 years later, she was 12, 12 and a half to be exact. Yeah.
And when she was like that, what you described there, that like her moving in with you guys and then that bit of that honeymoon period of like, ooh, okay, like I'm safe, like I'm away from this abuse. And then after a certain amount of time, like then she starts processing and like things start, you're obviously seeing this all kind of unfold. Did you know at the time that, how do I say, like when you were seeing that unfold, did you recognize that at the time for what it was? Did you have that awareness around that situation?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I had awareness before the situation.
Okay.
So what happened was we were starting to see this really odd behavior. Like she wouldn't do any homework during the week at all when she was at mom's. And like normally our weekends were really fun, right? We would plan like day trips because that's what weekends are supposed to be. And also because everybody's tired from the work week. So you're supposed to do like things that are rejuvenating to be able to, right, like get back into the swing of things. So when she was younger, I guess maybe she hit it better, or perhaps it wasn't as prevalent, or maybe just in school, right? There's less demands. But then as she became at that point, she was in middle school already. And she had already been in middle school for a couple of years. So it started to become really obvious that, assignments were missing, things weren't turned in. She wasn't doing well as far as grades with like what work she was doing. And when we would talk to her about it, though, there was a lot of remorse, right? So that's an inconsistency. And we would teach her whole concept. So our whole weekends turned into teaching her how to write an essay, all of the components, and like having her go and do it, and then like having us review it with her and having her go back and do it. And like it was just this back and forth for the whole weekend, teaching her, having her catch up on science and like whole science projects or history or math, like whole concepts, a week's worth of work. We would cram into essentially from the time my husband picked her up on Friday afternoon after school until Sunday, like just past dinner time. And it was really hard. And it started to get worse and worse because naturally school was more demanding, but also like, and we would just try to understand like what's going on. And we even went to the effort of like putting together a very detailed step by step of like, hey, here's like what we do, like so that, and sent it home with her and talked to mom so that like they could replicate it to try to like have some consistency. And of course, we have no control, right, of what happens in the other house, but um we really tried everything, and things were getting worse, and it felt like the tension was worse, and she also, it seemed like it was more challenging for her to do the work, which naturally with trauma that makes a lot of sense, right? Like when you're in survival mode, essentially it kind of takes our logical brain offline. So the brain that is able to learn new information and put together and organize concepts and have the cause and effect thinking or critical thinking, like all that essentially goes offline. And essentially the longer and more extensive the exposure to trauma is, the more disruptive that becomes. So of course, now hindsight 2020, that makes sense that she was struggling in those ways. But for me, I started to get, so with my ex-husband, I started to get this like toxic feeling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but that was the thing that was starting to grow, that I was like, okay, I can't ignore this anymore. It feels like almost like a cancer. Thank God I've never had that, but that's what it felt like. I'm like, it just feels like poison is growing inside of me and it's growing bigger, and I need to do something before it takes me. And interestingly, with her, it was a similar feeling that started to grow. Like it would twist me up into a knot because I was just racking my brain and talking to my husband all the time. Like, what could it be? Like, do you think it's this? Do you think it's this? Do you think she's just missing out on time with mom? Do you think like she's not getting enough attention? Like, what do you think could be happening? And, sometimes we would bring some of these questions to her, right? Because like maybe it's scary to name it, that's a common thing with kids. Just giving them a safe space to explore and share their thoughts. And again, she just would deflect and was quiet until she just blurted out this anecdote that was horrifying, of essentially being fed alcohol as a 9-year-old by her stepdad. And yeah, and similar such stories. And it was terrifying, but it's for us, because it had been building for about a year and a half and had been progressively getting worse, and we had no solution and nothing really like by way of explanation for this. It it is it was simultaneously for me like the worst fear coming true, and at the same time relief, because it's like we finally know the issue and we can do something about that, right? Like once
Yeah.
as much as it's the worst kind of nightmare maybe, and will be a huge lift, but at least now you know exactly what needs to be addressed and what needs to be done. So it was it's the weirdest feeling. I can't quite explain, because it was like the biggest relief and also the worst nightmare simultaneously. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I hope
Ter
that answered your question.
yeah. No, terror and relief are two very kind of
Yeah,
opposing emotions. So to feel it
exactly.
simultaneously. Yeah. So what was the from there then? I mean, what was kind of your role in helping her to open up, to explore, to
Yeah.
start to kind of
Yeah.
face this issue
Well,
head on?
yeah. Well, first of all, I was the first person she told this anecdote to. So my husband and I would do a check-in with her. And because she had already been home, so typically I'd get home later from work on Friday from my corporate job. And so he would have already caught up with her. So it was like my catch-up time. So we were like doing our usual catch-up time. And she just was like, well, you know how, my stepdad gives me hard alcohol sometimes. It's like, what like what, tell me more. And so my job was, my first job was like, don't freak out, get the details. So I did that. And then I was encouraging her, I'm like, you need to talk to mom and dad about this. And I didn't realize she had already talked to mom. Mom was fully aware for at least 2 years and like didn't do anything about it. And so my first order was like to encourage her to talk to dad. And then simultaneously, I need to talk, like, this, there's something serious happening. And he also was very assertive, and he could tell, because it was like, on the one hand, it's not my job to tell, but at the same time, like, this is serious and he needs to know. And thankfully, because he's so perceptive, like, that ended up kind of happening simultaneously, where he could tell something's up. And then he has a phenomenal relationship and way with her. So he was able to get her talking. So our first order of business was to call mom, who was working, because it's very common. Again, I was a victim of domestic abuse, so I know how those situations are. I also know, again, as we've mentioned, like, what it's like to be coerced and kind of feeling a loyalty to the partner and not fully realize that maybe that you're in a situation that you're in over your head. So the first thing was to check with mom, like, hey, are you okay? Like, right, like, check the facts, like, see what her perspective is, like, all the things, and essentially talk to her about, like, do you need help leaving, right? Like, that was kind of what we were exploring. And mom just sort of like brushed everything off and said she would talk to her husband. And we were like, with everything we found out, like, this is beyond talking, right? But we were like, okay, like, let's see. And we also didn't find out all the details right away. We found out that weekend, and then we also found out more the following weekend. So we had offered my stepdaughter, like, hey, do you want to go back? Like, do you, at the end of the weekend, like, do you want to go back? Like, do you not want to go back? Because if you don't want to go back, just say the words. Like, dad was like, I have your back. Like, don't worry. But she wanted to go back. And then, um, nothing, like, I guess he came into her room, according to her, at 5 a.m. one morning, like, on his way to work or something like that, and was like, hey, I'm sorry, or something awkward. Like, it was not handled, it was not addressed, there was no conversation, there was no like real um, you know, exploration of significant things, nor any like actual changes that were being suggested or made or anything like that. So and then when we found out more the following weekend, basically Monday morning, we were on our way to court. Like, we were on our way to meet with a lawyer and drafted up the affidavit. Thursday, like, it got filed during the week. Then Thursday, my husband appeared in court. And then the common procedure is that they notify the other parent, right, to give them an opportunity to also kind of contest or, what have you. And so I think they appeared in court on Monday the following week, and the judge left it. This was the longest 48 hours of our lives. The judge said, I will have a decision within the next 48 hours. So it just felt like all the air was sucked out of the courtroom, and like we just we just didn't have air for the next 48 hours. But what happened was, given that this was a DCF case with all of the abuse that had transpired and mom knowing, um, basically, so the way it worked, it was like on the docket, like, we checked with our lawyer, like, there's nowhere that we could see what the final decision was, but the DCF person called and left my husband a message saying, we understand you have full physical custody of your daughter. So that was how we found out. So we found out through a message through DCF, trying to come in and do their investigation.
Wow.
And yeah, yeah, it was insane. But thankfully, we were able to have full physical custody of her through the trial, which lasted a year and a half. And then ever since, and it could have gone really differently, because I hear stories all the time. Not that it doesn't matter what kind of abuse, but it's just, ultimately everything is just a big question mark until they're able to fully review everything and have the trial, et cetera. Oh man, sorry. Thought I was gonna sneeze. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you had already, cultivated quite an open, honest, and kind of safe relationship with her
Yeah.
where she was able to share that with you. And like you said, you were the first person that she told, um, which is really powerful. And yeah, I would just like to explore that a little bit more in that, like your role as a stepmother. Obviously, like you had all your own personal experience in that, so you were kind of like aware you'd been in the other shoes, so to speak. So you were like
Yeah.
very aware of like how certain things you say or you do might affect this little girl, right? What are some ways that you intentionally like cultivated that relationship that
Yeah.
eventually like allowed her to open up
Yeah.
to you in that way and that led to all these other things transpiring?
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately, it probably had less to do with what I did, though it played a role. I think it probably had to do more with what she wasn't getting or wasn't feeling like she was getting from mom, right? Because ultimately, mom and dad, biological parents will always win out. Doesn't matter, what you compare it to. I was just watching an episode of This Is Us. I'm not sure if you have watched it. I'm obsessed with that show. It's phenomenal. But basically, it's so this couple had adopted, they had two kids of their own. They were supposed to have triplets, ended up adopting one. And it was a Black child, and they happened to be a white family. And this child was kind of, like naturally, right? Like he had a little bit of trouble like identifying, right? Or like how people would look at them funny and all these different things. And that was something he was combating most of his life. And he found this one teacher at his school. He went to this gifted school that he related to, who was also Black and also like in a predominantly white school. So it was like they had that identifiable like factor between them. And when the father found out about this teacher that his kid was constantly raving about, and they had like a secret handshake and all these things, he was clearly getting a little bit jealous, right? Like he wanted the best for his son. He wanted him to have all the experiences. He was glad that he had a mentor, et cetera. But at the same time, it was obvious he was a little jealous. And his wife said to him, she's like, "What's going on?" She's like, what? I mean, if it's you compared to anybody, like even Albert Einstein, like you're gonna win. Like there is no competition. And I think that so perfectly encapsulates it. You know what I mean? It's not about, it doesn't matter how possibly like great, not to say, no, I'm not saying it was so great. I'm just saying it doesn't matter, right? Like what the kind of ideal that you're pairing that up against, because the physiological need and want is always for the biological parent, the connection, the affirmation, the support, I want them to be proud of me, right? Like I want them involved in my life. So I think it really had more to do with what she probably wasn't getting or wasn't feeling like she was getting from mom. But as far as what I wanted to make sure I did that I felt was really difficult with like my own parents and their divorce or just being an immigrant, I felt like I never really had like enough of a cheerleader or like enough like attention, and like it was the nuances, like oh, it's chilly. Like, let me, let me make sure you're warm enough, right? Like, and it's okay if you forgot your shirt. Like, here, I have this shawl or I have this sweater. It's going to be too big for you, but that's fine. Like little things
Mm,
are like, oh, you're tired. Let me carry you, like just the little thoughtful things was what, like just kind of noticing, right? Like noticing
right.
and then offering something to just take care of them a little bit, and be attentive in that way. And then again, like to your point, I also had this thirst for communication, and I felt like my primary caregivers, they just, we don't talk about feelings. Like that just wasn't a thing in my culture. And I wanted to make sure that she had a safe space to talk about feelings because there's a lot of feelings in a blended family after a divorce. And when you have new people coming into your life, it's a lot. It's heavy. There's a lot to make sense of. There's a lot to process. There can easily be misconceptions. And if you just have sometimes a place to that where it's okay to explore some of that and even possibly like somebody offering a different perspective on the situation that may make all the difference and just make it a little easier, or even knowing like, oh yeah, that's normal, that's common, a lot of kids feel this way in these situations, right? Like, or it'll get better with time sometimes, right? Like just depending on what the subject matter is and what the specific thing is. So I wanted to make sure to check in with her, like, and she didn't talk a lot, especially about how she felt. So I was like it's okay, like share, and so I would share sometimes just to give her the invitation, like it's okay to share, like it's normal to share. And so I think she got used to our check-ins and to sharing because I would ask a lot of questions. So it sort of became like our thing.
Yeah, and that's just, just what you said right at the end, like asking a lot of questions, especially if the child is like a little bit shy or like doesn't talk a
Yes.
whole lot. And also, I really love what you said about like you expressing your stuff and to kind of show,
Yeah.
like to lead by example and to be like, it's cool to
Yes.
talk about these things. Like,
Yes.
let's make it normal. So, okay,
Yes,
I like that.
I will say one quick caveat. I feel it's my responsibility is just to like you do also always want to make sure that you are creating an appropriate barrier and not putting too much of the heavy load onto the kids. So sharing, responsibly, if you will, appropriately. And sometimes people are like, they want like age appropriate, but I actually think like considering the emotional age, the intellectual age of the child is more important because development is not necessarily something that always happens according to like the textbook milestones. So
Yeah.
really assessing like where is your child at emotionally, like how mature are they, and what kinds of concepts can they grasp and identify with versus what is just a little bit beyond them, and speaking to them in that way, and always again being mindful not to put too much onto the child. So speaking about like common things that are challenging, right? Like different dynamics, different personalities can be challenging, like different rules can be challenging, but not getting into never speaking ill of a parent,
Mhm.
or a parent's choices or anything like that. And never, bad mouthing and never like blaming anything having to do with like the divorce, the dynamic, like discipline, and nothing like that, like completely 100% staying away from that, even for kids who are older, because nonetheless, there are loyalty binds and kids just have a way of, then um, it becomes difficult because they end up having a complicated, it basically separates them from one of the parents, right? Because if they can blame somebody for the divorce or some aspect of the divorce, then they even though they want to see that parent because they are half of them, it creates a rift, and
Yeah.
it just creates a lot more stress and pressure for them that is completely unnecessary. And they deserve to love both of their parents because whatever happened between the adults is what happened between the adults. That is no reflection on the parent-child relationship. And so that should be handled separately and be its own thing and be allowed to be that.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good thing to note too, because it's kind of like kids don't really, again, depending on the age and the emotional maturity, they don't really know any better. So for one parent to kind of like pitch the kid against the other,
Yes.
that can be very traumatic in the long
Yes.
term too, and
Yes.
and very toxic.
Yeah.
Um,
And parents,
so
look, they often don't mean to do it, right? Like they're also human, they're also dealing with a lot, so I get that. But if and when you do it, just calling it out and saying, I was just lashing out, I was just angry, I was just having a moment, I don't really feel that way. And really just trying your best if you think you're going to do that, or if you think you need that. We all need, a safe place to go, to talk, to vent, what have you. Do it where it's appropriate, like with your friends, with your therapist, with a coach, in a support group, right? Like there's plenty of spaces you can go and be with other adults, but just really trying your best not to do that with your kids. Even if it means you go into the bathroom and you like run the water and you have a conversation with yourself, or, go in a car or whatever, go for a drive, whatever you need to do, just getting away from the kids to not expose them to that to the best of your ability.
Yeah, great point. So you work with families as well, and you do a four-step energy focused process where you identify quite a few different things like boundaries and values, getting on the same page as your partner. Tell us a little bit more about that process and um, yeah, how you work with families in that way.
Yeah. So I work often with step parents, but also as well with the divorced parent, because blending a family, right? Like it's often adult led, to be honest. And a lot of times I hear from people, oh, the child is struggling, they're having difficult behaviors, or they're super so rude and disrespectful, or they're not following rules, like they're lazy, or this or that. And truthfully, a lot of that is much more heavily influenced by the parents, believe it or not. And the reason I say that is that um, either it has something to do with the way that structure is handled in the home, or perhaps it's what they're seeing adults do. Kids are super perceptive, they're constantly watching, and doing the, do as I say and not as I do just doesn't work with kids. And we might not be aware of it. Like, again, we might literally not be aware of our own behavior sometimes because, like, it just doesn't, we have blind spots and we just don't notice. It also could be, oftentimes basically emotions are coming out sideways. So if there are a lot of stressors and kids are having a difficult time adjusting, whether it's maybe mom's boyfriend moved in really soon after the divorce and it's very tense, and the child feels like they're being kind of pushed to the side, that they're not getting any attention maybe anymore with mom. Perhaps this is just a completely like fake scenario for them for the purposes of exploring
Yeah.
this a little bit. Um, and or maybe even, like when normally kids are really well behaved and then suddenly like they're acting out in school, right? Like all of these things are typically an indication that something else is going on. Oftentimes it is something emotional that is happening for them, and it's just a challenge adjusting, or they're not feeling like they're being heard, or they're not being they're not feeling supported enough through the transition, and really cultivating the relationships, like still preserving the ones with their parents, but also possibly they might need some help, and often do, cultivating relationships with the new partners. And kids very typically take a much longer time to even come around to the idea of their parents having new partners, because a lot of times for several years, it's common for kids to feel like their parents are going to get back together and to wish for
Mm.
that.
Mhm. Yeah, and I guess like a lot of that behavior, like you said, like acting out in certain ways, like it doesn't necessarily like correlate to like it's like a reaction to something that's kind of like,
Yes,
why are you doing that? But it's like obviously there's an emotional issue and it's, perhaps they don't have the tool, right? They're feeling these confusing emotions and they don't have the tools to be able to cope. So they like act out at school or they, skip class or they're like causing ruckus like somewhere else in their life. And I guess it's important to kind of look at that and go, okay, well, like what is actually the issue here? And let's talk about it and like open up the conversation to it.
exactly. You nailed it 100%. That's exactly it. They very commonly don't have the skills to even identify it for themselves, let alone communicate that effectively to even their parents. And they certainly oftentimes don't have the coping skills. They don't even know what the options are or what that would look like. So, unless we are specifically and intentionally teaching our kids these skills. So,
Hmm.
again, it's often an opportunity for the whole family, but certainly for the parents to really like support their kids by talking to them. And don't get me wrong, professionals are great. But I can't stress how important it is to have parents who are involved. And I mean, on an emotional level, on a hands on level, noticing, paying attention, and creating a safe space, and being a caregiver that the child feels comfortable coming to and saying, hey, I'm struggling. Or sometimes they're not comfortable. They don't even notice that they're struggling. So they need the parent to identify, like, hey, they're struggling,
Right.
and possibly even like communicate that to the support resource, like be it a therapist or some other third party, whether it's through family therapy or maybe the child has their own therapist, but again, they just need more support. And helping them to cope, to identify what's going on, and to make sense of it, and to come up with effective strategies and solutions to move forward.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's like it's so important, like even just this conversation right now and the work that you do. Like I commend you for this. This is incredible because,
Thank you.
in this day and age, like statistically speaking, more marriages actually end in divorce that don't. So there's obviously going to be a lot of children and even older children like out there that are, that this is true for them. I actually
Yeah.
heard it was a comedian actually, and I heard something a couple weeks ago, and he kind of made a joke about divorce and like kind of brought like lightness to it, where it's like as a child, it's like, okay, well, I'm a product of these two people, and if these two people can't even get along, like what about me? Like I'm
Right.
what does that mean for me? That means like these two parts of
Yes.
me that make me up. Like if they can't get
Yeah.
along, then what like I'm
Yeah.
falling apart
Yeah.
here.
It's funny. I think that there's a common misconception among all of us where like, oh, well, once they hit a certain age, they'll just get over it, you
Mm,
know? But time doesn't just heal wounds, right? Like the work heals the wounds. When you process, when you make sense of your experience, when you gain skills, when you do that, the only way out is through, or something like that. I'm not sure if that's the phrase, but that's the one that comes to mind. Like
yeah.
it doesn't just magically go away. And I think it's an unfair expectation, because let's think of ourselves, right? Like think of, how you were parented, or all those gripes or whatever, those things that you have about being with your family, right? Or like that's usually the most relatable one. I would say there's always like one thing that mom or dad or that weird uncle does that like just annoy you or creep you out or whatever it is, right? Like we all have those triggers. Have you gotten over it? Probably not, unless you have done the work, right, to make sense of it, and to like accept it, or to like identify it for what it is and why it was that way, and make sure that you're like good with moving forward beyond that, and accepting it with love, because everybody is doing the best they can. That's the key to understand about this. Nobody is setting out to be a horrible parent, or like just make life miserable, or to, and that's the thing I think really that's so key to remember. Kids, when they're misbehaving or making life difficult, like they're not doing it on purpose. They're trying to communicate something. Adults
Yeah.
are also not purposely, neglecting their children or ignoring or even abusing. Like this all happened for a reason. Clearly, these are patterns that have been laid out. This is what they have likely, either observed or were exposed to, or perhaps experienced most of their lives. And it would be unfair to just assume we just evolve beyond it or outgrow this behavior or this way of thinking. So I can't stress how important it is to give yourself the time and space to do the work. Um, and I would love to take this opportunity, because I was just thinking about this earlier, and I don't think I talk about it enough, but we live in such a phenomenal time where there are these remarkable tools that are being created all the time, or that have existed and are coming to light, or maybe just more are easily accessible because of the advent of technology, that enable us to do that work much faster, much more effectively, with much better results. For example, I am a rapid resolution therapy practitioner, and that modality is absolutely phenomenal. Like it blows my mind. It's the thing I used to wish for as a child, that I thought was too good to be true. It was like my fairy tale. And then I stumbled on it as an adult, and I was a major skeptic, right? Because of course, right? Like if I'm gonna stumble into the fairy tale that I've always dreamed of, like of course I'm gonna be a skeptic about it. But I have to say it's been life altering. I have greatly benefited from it myself. My family has practiced with, colleagues of mine, and I've done this work with clients who had amazing results, and I am just so like ecstatic to to share that this modality exists. And there are others, right? Like I'm not saying it's a one size fits all. I'm not saying there's only one solution. I just think it's really exciting that there are ways to address these things without, like if somebody's like, oh my God, therapy, what a, like, or whatever the thing is that's not for them, just try, just try some other things, explore, get out there and look. And I think for me in my own experience, and I was a very sheltered person, like just thinking back when this all started, I think probably the most significant shift for me was when I left my ex-husband. Um, it just starts with the desire, right? Like if you're just like, oh, I'm just so tired of these patterns. I'm just tired of creating the same old, like running into the same wall, right? Or just feeling so run down, or just feeling miserable, or fighting, or bickering, like whatever the thing is, just allow yourself like the opportunity to wish for it to be easier and better and just lean into it and the answers will reveal themselves, like that was how it
Mm.
happened for me. The resources I needed, the information I needed, like the way lit up once I allowed myself to just be, once I released the no, like I have to control it or like this is the way it is, like once I let go of that, that's when everything was able to come into existence, which is, yeah. So that's like my best tip, I think, for anybody who might be in a similar boat.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a powerful insight. And like one thing that you mentioned in there too that reverts back to like emotional intelligence as a whole is, you mentioned like the patterns, like, oh, these things keep coming up. And it really starts with awareness, right? Like it really starts with
Yes.
kind of like looking at our situation. And if like we're feeling like uncomfortable or stuck or just feeling just crap, like
Yes.
we're out of alignment with something there. And so it really
Yes.
comes back to like figuring out, okay, well, what is the issue? And that basically just comes down to self-awareness, having self-awareness around, okay, what is it that I'm feeling? When and where and why do I feel that? Maybe you don't have the why, but like when and where do I feel that? When that comes up, like what's going on in my world? And then starting to recognize these patterns and
Mhm.
starting to kind of ask ourselves the questions of
Yes.
not like you said, not having to like have the answers, but just like recognizing like, okay, this is a problem and this continues to be a problem.
Yes.
And, this is why I love having these conversations because I
Yeah.
think for me, when I was kind of in my stuckness, I
Mhm.
had a similar experience with a narcissistic partner as well. And it was just that feeling of like, just really feeling lost and confused and like not really knowing where to go and who to turn
Yeah.
to or who to ask. And that's why I'm so passionate about, this entire topic and having these conversations and bringing this to people because, I really encourage anyone listening to this episode right now that's relating to things that you're saying that's like, oh, I struggle with that, to please reach out
Yes,
to
please.
Maria and get some help because
Yeah.
you're not supposed to like have to figure this out on your own. There are support and there are resources. And like you said, you had an
Yeah.
experience when you were a young girl, like, oh, I wish this existed. And
Yeah.
lo and behold, it does, right? Like you just gotta
Right.
look in the right places, or like you said, just kind of like surrender to like, okay, I need help. And
Yes.
then once you kind of make that decision of like, all right, something needs to change here, then like you said, the things just kind of come your way when you really are
Yeah.
rooted in that.
Absolutely. I think what another way to just like really hammer bring this point home perhaps is, if you're feeling miserable or, whatever the thing is, right, that doesn't feel good. Well, that means that the opposite of that also exists, right?
Mm,
Because like we're in this universe, like there's literally no limit, right? So, and just because you don't know how or what or the way doesn't mean that there isn't a way. It just means you just haven't discovered it yet. Like that's the key is like it's the yet, right? And also there's no such thing as like sometimes we beat ourselves up with like, oh, it's too late, or I wasted so much time, or I've invested so much energy. Like, I need to make this work. Like we all get, I think, a little bit caught up in some of those patterns of thinking and expectations of ourselves, like to do the impossible. Like, no, I'm gonna jam this square into this circle, like I'm gonna
yeah.
be the one, I'm gonna beat the, you know what I mean? Like whatever the laws of physics. And no, that means that that's not the way, right? Like if it feels really, really hard, because like I can tell you, my ex used to always tell me, well, relationships are hard work. That's how you know that it's like really good, is like it's really hard work. And like that's how you know. And I was like, yeah, but it doesn't feel like it's supposed to be this hard. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
like it's been hard work in my current relationship, but it's been a very different kind of hard work. Like there's still a levity and a lightness and like so much joy. And I feel like with my other relationship, it wasn't that way. It almost felt like some of it was like orchestrated, you know, or like
Mm,
just when it was feeling joyous, like suddenly it would become really like, you know, how like you're like, um, to maybe have like a movie analogy or like a very obvious analogy, there's like a beautiful sunny day, and then suddenly it's like the clouds roll in and it's like stormy and dark and like the thunder and the lightning and it's like torrential downpour. It was like that. But I remember distinctly being aware and I couldn't put my finger on it, but I was like, but it feels like it didn't need to be that, you know, like the storm didn't
mm,
have to come. Like somebody almost like, you know, like, I don't know, like push the button or like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know,
yeah.
like it was just this nagging feeling in the back of my mind or in the back of like, I don't know, my stomach perhaps, where it just felt like it was unnecessary. And so, again, in case you're in this situation and any of this resonates for you, just know like you're not alone. That's normal for those scenarios. And also, it can be different. It doesn't have to be that way. And that's usually a sign that something else is going on that's off. And so just, it can be easy. It can feel good.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good point to make because I can actually relate. I'm in a situation right now. Situation. I shouldn't call it a situation. I'm in a relationship right now. Um, and comparatively to my past relationship with a narcissist, like, yeah, it was hard, but it was like in the past it was hard and it didn't feel right. Like it didn't
Yeah.
feel like that's how it should be. And now, yes, we're learning who each other are and we're growing and we're having tough conversations and sometimes we get in fights over things because our communication isn't really on par, but it's it's a growth space. Like
Yes.
we
Yes.
we we might not always see eye to eye, and if things get heated, we're able to kind of like cool it down, come back around, offer perspective, offer understanding and compassion, and like work through it and talk through it. And yeah, it's hard because you're getting to know this person and you're blending these two lives. And I totally get what you mean. Like it's a different kind of hard. It's almost like if I can kind of sum it up, it's almost like the hard that I'm experiencing now is like hard with a positive outcome. Like it might be you might be in the
Yes.
challenge, but then it's like, oh, okay, we figured it out. Whereas before it was like it's hard and it's like, am I ever gonna get out of this trench?
Yes. Yes. There's like no end, no
There's no
end in sight.
end.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
like that's not hard. That's just toxic as fuck.
Right. Exactly. That's what
Like,
it was. Like I didn't realize with my poor husband and like literally he's such a saint for putting up with this, but for years like I didn't realize I picked up the most toxic patterns of communication.
mm,
And I would feel these waves of being completely isolated. Like I remember at one point going to a psychiatrist because I was just like, because I went to a therapist and then I described some of how I was feeling, and she's like, "You might benefit from a beta blocker," like literally, because it was so bad. And this feeling I was experiencing is that in the middle of, you know, an argument, I just felt completely abandoned and like I was in this ocean with like extremely turbulent waves, like completely by myself on like a piece of like shipwrecked, you know, like wood. And I
yeah.
was just like totally at the mercy of like everything else, like basically just kind of like impending doom and gloom. And
Like
and
Rose DeWipicator on the
yeah,
Titanic. Like,
yes, literally. And you know, and then like it would eventually cease, but it was like I was unreachable
mm,
in that state. And so there was no possibility for effective or productive communication. And then I also had developed this, I think they call it like a dry drunk syndrome, where basically you black out because of like anger and or fear. And so you also are remembering like bits of the conversation and like what happened in an out of order. So it's
right.
hard to like put things together.
Hmm.
And I'm convinced that that was just based on like the abuse and like the years and years of this abusive toxic cycle. And because I mean, obviously, you know, once I started to heal from that, that that got better, but it took a long time. So just I think having a lot of compassion for yourself, like you are where you are, it's okay, and you're still beautiful and amazing and worthy and lovely, and you can have a phenomenal life. Like it's okay. You know, like there is a way out of it, there's a way through it, and all the things are still for you. Like I think that was that was the thing that was really difficult to hear, that I almost didn't believe in the darkest of those moments. And so I really hope that whoever is listening who might be in a similar position, that they can hear, like, from one survivor to another. Um, it, yeah, it definitely can get better. You can heal like way beyond where you think you can. There is no, it's not like, oh, like there are times that I remember thinking, I was like, I think I'm going to be emotionally maimed for the rest of my life, or I'm this monster, because I was led to believe that I was a monster because my family didn't know how to deal with me. And my ex blamed me for all the things.
Mm,
So my narrative became, I'm a monster. I'm this horrible monster that's totally worthless. And that wasn't true. None of that was true. And so it was just a matter of healing through it. And it all started with a seed of like the desire. So,
mhm. And knowing too, I think like because I had, my own experience as well and the growth. And for me, there was definitely I'm still in it for sure. Like I'm still healing and growing, but that kind of 3 to 4 years post relationship, um, one really positive thing is when you're really in it and you're really, in the dark depths, like you said, you want to feel better. You just want to feel better. You just want to feel back to yourself. And the good news is you never go back to yourself because once you go through all that, guess what? You become an elevated version of who you were prior.
yes,
And it's actually a
yes,
really beautiful thing.
yes, with all the wisdom. And thank you for
Yeah.
mentioning that. And I think I wanted to mention that before. So, the one thing that I think enabled me to really support my back then stepdaughter, now daughter, during that most critical time, was because I had been in her shoes to a degree, even though it was like very different circumstances as to why and how, but
Yeah.
still I could recognize what the surface level looked like and what she was likely thinking and feeling and hoping for deep down underneath the bristly, like harsh, like prickly and exterior, right? Because it's like she was just so deeply hurting. And I remember having similar thoughts where, like, on the outside, I was just like, get away from me, like, like a cat. But the reality was, all I wanted was like an embrace and a hug,
Yeah.
and just like from, my mom or whoever to be there. And I think it was that wisdom that enabled me to support her best, because I could recognize that and I could like check that out with her. And, I would say, hey, I remember when I was going through something similar, like this is how I would feel. Does that resonate with you? And I remember at one point she was lying down on the couch and she was covered under like with a blanket and just her head was out. And then I said that to her and she just like cover over her head. And I was like, I think that's my cue to just snuggle her. Um, it's hard to admit these things, because it just feels like I don't want to have to say it. You know what I mean? I don't want to have to ask for it, or fear of being rejected again, or, like all the things. And um yeah, I think it was going through those experiences that gave me the wisdom that has then allowed me to have insights, into her experience that she sometimes isn't even able to recognize. But yeah, that's the gift I think that we give to anybody else that's in our circle, right? And in our world, is we get to grow through that and gain the insights and gain the gifts of the wisdom, and then we get to share that with others.
Beautiful. Beautifully said. This has been an incredible conversation. So much value.
Yeah,
You have so much
thank you.
knowledge and experience. I really appreciate you sharing everything that you shared today. I did want to get into talking about, kids and technology these days because it's so
Yes.
important. But honestly, I think we should just wrap it up at that. And if you'd be happy to
Yeah,
come back, like I feel like
I would
that's like a
love to.
whole other episode that we could
Yeah,
dive into, right? Because there's a lot to unpack within that as well,
absolutely.
setting healthy boundaries around
Yes.
technology and really the all the emotional aspects of that. So if you're cool with
Yeah,
that,
I would love
let's
to come back. Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I
yeah.
really enjoyed this conversation too. Thank you so much for having me on, Livia.
It's honestly been my pleasure. So much value. And like I said before, encouraging people that if any of this is resonating, if they're going through any of these similar dynamics in their own life at the moment, to please reach out to you. How can
Yes.
people do that? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, my website, obviously. I have also plenty of free resources. I put out a podcast every week, and yeah, and I think, that's where they can also grab my social media handles, and I do lives every week as well. But I think just direct message too. Email Maria at synergisticstepparenting.com. There's two P's in step parenting. Um, yeah, that's a great way. And I love to offer, free consults for everything, the rapid resolution sessions. Also, obviously, if they're looking for step parenting support or just blended family support, I just love to share, any resources that I have a conversation, help them, assess where things are at and what would be the best steps moving forward. And I also have an extensive network that I also love to connect people with as well. So again, there's like absolutely no obligation. Just don't go through it alone is the point. Reach out, connect, and explore what the resources are. But one just quick word of caution. Make sure whoever you're speaking to, if you decide you're going to work with somebody, whatever their designation is, therapist, coach, it doesn't matter. Maybe a divorce professional if you're in the early stages and considering divorce, make sure that it's a click. Make sure you feel comfortable. Make sure you feel comfortable sharing the complete story and getting advice, and that you are not feeling judged. Just, whatever that word click means to you, make sure that that exists, because no matter how many designations somebody might have, sometimes I think we assume that somebody's experience or background or particular kind of schooling, that is the be all and end all, because sometimes, our systems kind of make us believe that. Because I think, being a vetted professional is important, and certainly being a qualified professional is really important. But I just want to say, don't only rely on those designations. Make sure that you're actually having a conversation with a person before you decide whether or not you work with them. And I also want to encourage you to have a conversation with maybe a couple of others as well, so you have somebody to compare them to, and go with the person that you feel you have a click with. And if it requires looking for additional resources because you haven't found that yet, then do yourself a favor and do it, because it'll only make your experience better and will ensure your overall well-being and that you get the support that you actually need.
Incredible. Thank you so much
Of
again.
course.
And we'll definitely be chatting with you again soon. Thank you, Maria.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
All right.